And welcome everybody to another Bangers and Classics podcast, which has me, James Ruppert, in it, and him, David Malloy. And let's find out what David's been up to in the past week or so.
Oh, loads of DIY, James. Absolute loads of
Oh, right.
DIY. Hardly been out of the house. And sadly, I have seen absolutely no interesting cars anywhere. It's really, really quite shocking. Only thing of note I can say is yesterday, that's the 29th of July, is the first anniversary of me publishing my first ever book. It was an ebook. And yeah, it was kind of a noteworthy day. We'll admit of having had a couple of small glasses of beer yesterday evening in celebration. But what I would say to listeners is, if you're thinking of doing something, something you've always wanted to do it. Give it a shot, because you might find it's easier than you think once you get past the initial sort of inertia and initial reticence at doing it. So just bear that in mind. If you want to do something really badly, do it. What's the worst that can happen?
Well, I don't know. I think there are probably some fairly terrible things that can happen, David. But if we can do it, if we can have a go at things, everybody can.
Yeah.
There you go. There's our positive message for today.
Well, I mean, Dr. Pepper, what's the worst that can happen?
Exactly.
That's it. They say so it must be true. Anyway, yes. So the Nations Cup will be up. By the time we read this, we should be into the semi-finals. But we're just about to put that up on the website today. Having lost control of the Bangers and Classic Twitter account yesterday evening for reasons that are beyond my comprehension, I suspect it's been a bit of a mess up back at Twitter HQ, but never mind. We are there now. And there's one other thing I think we should mention. I did say on Twitter recently that Bangers and Classic are going to embark on a quest. And we are going to do that, James, aren't we? We're going to look for something that was lost a long time ago.
We certainly are.
It's disappeared from sight. Using technology, including something that floats, and that's a bit of a clue there. We're going to try and find it before the summer is out. We're not going to say too much about it just now, just in case it all falls apart and we end up having to take to the life rafts.
Well, I'm sure it won't come to that, David.
James, every boat I've ever been on has been dive bombed or torpedoed, and two of them were in peacetime.
Really? No.
Yeah.
Well, I've always got my water wings on, so I'll be keeping those on, and
Yeah.
I might even put them on my legs as well.
Yeah, you got to be careful. We don't want to trade those in for a different kind of wings, obviously.
No, of course not.
No. But there we go. Anyway, enough of my nonsense. What about you? What cars have you? What have you been up to this last 7 days?
Well, everybody would be really pleased to hear that I have actually found the Baby Shark, the old E21. Yeah, it is apparently all okay to be MOT'd, but the only thing is that it does need an exhaust, and the disappointing thing is, obviously, I discussed all this with the garage, and obviously they've got more important things to do, because the bloke said, "Well, you can have it back later on today if you can get me an exhaust," because he said, I can't find one." So I thought, oh, well, that's good. So I've been on a quest, David, a quest around the world, and you'd think it'd be fairly straightforward to find, a piece of metal, tubular shaped, that will go from one end of the car to another, but apparently not, for a car that's over 40 years old now. And so I'm actually dealing with people in Poland, and I've bought a back box and a middle box, and those are on their way to us. So let's hope it makes it to us. I should get them at the end of next week, and then they can be welded on board.
Crumbs.
Yeah, and obviously this will help in our quest, because how could I possibly help you in any way, David, if I didn't have access to that sort of set of wheels? But yeah, hopefully it will all come together at some stage, but it's taking rather longer than I originally planned for, because I could have ordered this last week when I was talking to you about things, but never mind.
Yeah.
In between, actually, I know I've seen some spectacular classics in the last few weeks. Some top draw A1 gold plated classics. But actually, I've seen some quite nice bangers, and these are probably ones that we will have to debate at some point, because people will obviously clamour for that for
Right.
a definitive view. But a Rover 600, which I know is basically a Honda.
Banger.
But but again, it's one of those vehicles that isn't cherished and it is used. A relative of ours had one, and they basically ran it into the ground. It did obviously rust away. That was the reason why they did have to get rid of it. But it really was a spectacular car. It was impossible to kill, and all you did was service it and change
Hmm.
the brake pads, and it just ran and ran and ran. And yeah, I saw a tidy one in the car park, and you think, yeah, that's quite a nice, smart looking car, isn't it?
It is actually,
A
yeah, to
Rover.
be fair.
Yeah,
It is, to be fair.
yeah. And I was followed the other day by a full Puma, which are starting to become sort of quite rare. You used to see them everywhere,
Yeah.
and now they are actually becoming quite hard to see. And I know not everybody likes them, but if you've ever driven one, they're actually a huge amount of fun.
Hmm. They were
And
hoots. I mean, absolute.
you can still pick them up for a few hundred £100. And
Yeah.
this one looked quite tidy. Again, it's another one of those that can be killed by rust.
Yeah.
But again, I've had again friends and people in the family who just ran them forever because they were just fun to drive, very cheap to run, and yeah, it was hard to think of anything else which would be better value. So it was just quite nice to see one because I did think to myself, when was the last time I saw one? And it was quite some time ago. So yeah, I'm as well as looking out for classics, I'm always looking out for bangers.
Right. I mean, the Puma tends to be the rear wheel arches that go there.
Yeah.
That's usually the dreaded sign. But of
Mm,
course, you've got the standard Puma, and then you've got the Ford Racing Puma,
you have.
which is an absolute. It's a honey of a car. It really
Mm,
is. Fantastic little thing. The standard Puma is very good. I'll be honest. When it came out, I saw the advert. I thought there's absolutely no way Steve McQueen would be seen driving anything like that. And I am happy to say that I was completely and utterly wrong about that. It's a great little car and handles really well. It's very sharp. And I think Steve McQueen would have been quite happy at the wheel of one. We'll never know. But
no.
unfortunately, but yeah, they are good cars. Not to be confused with the modern aberration that's called a Puma.
No, no.
No, 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 no. But yeah, the Puma is a great little car. If you find one at a decent price and it's reasonably free of rust, it's a car probably to buy. Get properly rust protected. There are places that will do it and keep it. Because they are going to become fewer and fewer in number. There's no question. I mean, there used to be a very common sight, and I can't remember the last time I saw one in the road around here.
Yeah,
And they
difficult,
used to
isn't
be everywhere, yeah.
it? Mm,
So we don't want that to happen because they are great little cars. So save the Puma. So that's two interesting classics. The 600, James,
yeah,
it's a forgotten car, really, isn't it?
it
I mean,
is. Yeah, very
yeah.
much so.
It's obviously there are legions. Well, maybe not legions, but there are some Rover fans out there,
Yeah,
who like modern Rovers, and obviously they cherish the 600. But beyond that, it doesn't seem to have much of a following, or
no.
for there to be much interest in it. And I think again that's quite sad. Though I may have said it was a banger, that was just me being daft. It's a car. Yeah, well, it was. I need to think about it. I didn't think they were bad cars back in the day, but they're better than 99% of what you get brand new nowadays. And
Yeah,
at least in terms of character, very comfortable cars. And as you say, the running gear, very reliable indeed.
yeah.
But let's talk now of car from Rover that
Mm,
was, shall we say, a little bit less reliable because it's
yeah.
time for this week's banger or classic. And we have gone with the Rover SD1, the car that promised so much. James, what's your take on it?
It is a very difficult one because,
Mm.
in many ways, yes, it is a classic, and in other ways, it was a truly terrible car. It just never lived up to expectations. It wasn't terribly reliable. It was quite impressive as a traffic cop car. They always seem to be good. There's a very good YouTube video. I think, aren't they taking it's either blood or a heart from Stansted Airport, and actually they go past somewhere where I used to live, and they follow. It's a very old film. Obviously, it's from the 1980s, and you can see the car hair down the M11 and then drive into London, and that's very impressive. And that is a Rover 3.5 doing the business. So. Yeah, I think if they were police ones, because the police made sure that they were reliable, they looked after their cars very, very, very well. So you never saw them broken down by the side of the road. But the civilian ones, you do think to yourself, I don't know what was going on. I had a slight thing where I was in the back of an SD one that my dad was going to buy, and there was such a waiting list, and this was 19 would have been 1977. There was such a waiting list. They wanted £500 from him, and he wasn't going to pay that. So that was just £500 for the privilege of going to the front of the queue to buy an SD1. And even he knew, nah, I really don't think that's worth it. Basically go and buy a Mini for that. So that was what BL dealers were want to do at the time. But it was an impressive car to be in the back of. I do remember uh, the Vitesse ones is what people like, with the
Hmm.
twin plenum chambers and stuff like that. And I suppose in their way they are classics. And I know that people deliberately confuse them with Ferraris, because the styling is very, very similar. But in a way, I probably quite controversially quite like to say, nah, it's not a classic. Just just to annoy people, really, because as you say, it promised a lot. It delivered something, but it didn't deliver everything. In many ways, it should have been the new era, and BL should have made a fortune and stuff like that. And that's all your money gone there, David.
No, it's my wedding ring. I was just
Was it really?
yeah, I was
Wow,
cleaning my wedding ring.
that's quite that's quite an impressive wedding ring.
Yeah, well, it's
Ah,
yeah, made in Scotland from girders,
oh, fantastic! I'm pleased to
Yeah,
hear
it's the
that.
old Iron Brew advert.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
the S.
what's your view on the
Well,
old
maybe
SD1?
I just wish they'd made the SD1 from girders. It would have been a bit more
Yeah, it
robust.
would have been, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, it was good enough to win the European Car of the Year title for '77,
Mm,
and made a big impact. Really, Britain and across Europe. People were really interested in buying one. And then, of course, the strikes happened, and
yeah.
you couldn't get one for love nor money. And that's possibly why the Leyland dealers
Oh, yeah.
were charging a premium.
Mm,
Well, they couldn't get them. There were stories of, certainly in the continent, people going to garages, and the garages had no supply. They
yeah.
just could not get their hands on them.
Mm,
There was a program to try and get as many out as they could. Of course, then corners were cut, and the build quality was pretty awful. And then they made what I think was a big mistake. They brought out the six-cylinder versions, the
mm,
2300 and the 2600, and they were very problematic. Needed a bit more work before we really in the running gear before they were released, and they didn't get it. So that really damaged its reputation. They did bring out a four-cylinder version, if I recall correctly, as well, which was a little bit underpowered for the size of car. But the 3.5 litre one was obviously the one to have. Uh, it did well, as you say, it was a police car. Did well in the touring cars as well.
mm,
It was a good-looking car, good-looking racing car as well. I actually took some photographs of one not killed a couple of years ago. I think it was triplex colours. I'll maybe post a picture of that in the Bangers and Classic website because I've got it somewhere.
mm.
And it was fun to watch going around a damp track. The problem with the SD1 is it failed to capitalise on its initial impact. It wasn't the fault of the car. The basic car was good. Dodgy six-cylinder engines apart. It was a good design, good-looking car, and should have done great things. But at the end of the day, you have to say it was a wasted opportunity. It could have been so much more successful than it was. That said, I do like it, and I do think it's a classic. So my vote goes for classic in this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're wrong, David. As you say, you've got to be very specific about the engine, because there was actually a 2.4 VM diesel, wasn't there? I
Now,
think.
was it? Was it?
Hold on.
Hang on. Was that ever sold in this country? No, it did. Yeah, you're right. It came
Yeah,
in. I think it came in very late in the day, didn't it?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, because it wasn't available. I'll just check that just while we're sitting here.
Yeah, but
Um, I,
yeah, I mean, you are correct. If we're quite specific about the character for V8 engine, yeah, that's a classic. Whereas the others really didn't come up to any sort of standard, really.
no, and that's the sad thing.
It is.
Yeah. It came along later in life was the 2400 turbo diesel, and really they could have done with that back when it was launched. I think it would have helped a little bit possibly.
Mm.
But anyway, as I say, it's a classic. It may be a flawed classic, but it's a classic nonetheless. And the only sadness is that it really could have been so much more. We should move on from that, and we shall take a quick break. You're listening to Bangers and Classics, the most irreverent podcast in human history. Welcome back. After talking about the ST1, which in certain guises was quite a regal-looking car, let's talk now about classless cars. What car would you say, James, defied being categorised according to status?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would go for the really obvious ones because I own them. But that's not to say I'm classless, David.
There
I
we
mean, I
are.
always make a bit of a kerfuffle when I arrive anywhere at all. You know, there's often a rustle. But
Is it the same
uh,
guy?
yeah, yeah,
This
probably.
Russell fella.
Yeah, no, always make a bit of a stir whenever I arrive anywhere. But yeah, what you could the point that you're making, David, is yeah, there are certain cars that you can turn up with, and actually you sort of can't be judged in a way, or in some ways you can be. You know, you could be a very rich person, you know, rather like you, David, or you could be a working class scoundrel like me from the London area, and if you just turned up in the car and we didn't open our mouths, you'd think, well, yeah, he could be posh, he could be not, because he's in a car which defies categorization, and that's something that certainly happened with the Mini first, because the Mini was quite cheap to buy. Even though it shouldn't have been in the early 60s, which meant that celebrities bought it and racing drivers bought it. And that meant that, yeah, you could turn up in that, and you could be someone who just bought it because it was cheap, or you could be someone who
Hmm.
bought it because it was a good car.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Mini, and that went on, and that was used very effectively through the advertising as well. When you had Twiggy and you had Spike Milligan and people like that doing ads for it. But yeah, I mean, that I would say is the most obvious example, and then the most second obvious example would be a Land Rover, because yeah, you could be the landed gentry, or you could just be a farmer palmer who just about keeps his small holding going. But yeah, if you've got and it is specifically an older Land Rover, we're not talking Range Rovers at all, and we may not even be talking about certain Defenders. If you have a pimped up Defender, I don't think you're classless. I don't know, you
Hmm.
may disagree with that, David, but yeah, if you've got something like a ratty Defender or a ratty Series 3 or 2A or something like that, um, then yeah, it's a car where you could turn up for anything, and they wouldn't turn you away, which is quite significant.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely, James.
Yeah.
Uh, got a couple of ones I would like to put forward.
Yeah,
If you live in a warm place, and
yeah,
especially near the Mediterranean, if you live near a port, the Citroen Miari,
yeah,
that's a very classless car, I think. Could be
yeah,
used by someone who's got a boat, just a small business, or just someone who likes an open car, because it's a brilliant car for the right climate. It really is. Then you've got the Volkswagen Golf. Not my favourite car, from being honest, but obviously in the 80s, it really
mm,
hit its stride, I think, and it was beloved by more than just the Chelsea set. It was very popular. It was the Sloan Rangers, but it was also very popular, across the spectrum of society, you might say. It was a very
mm.
popular car. I just never got the invitation to the party, that was all.
All right.
And I would have said the Matravancio, but I suspect people might, if you bought one of those, people might think, is it because you couldn't afford a Range Rover?
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't that much cheaper than a Range Rover.
No.
Yeah, there's a couple more. Just looking at this. I've written down the MX5, but I think that's clueless rather than classless.
All right.
I had to say it, sorry. Got to get the digs in, that's it. One I think might have been classless, but never came here, would be the Mark 1 Renault Twingo. A fun, funky little city car. I
That's
could have
right.
seen that appealing right across a spectrum as well. And the last one, and I may be wrong about this, I probably am wrong about this, was a Reliant Scimitar GTE.
Mm.
Obviously, a certain member of the royal family has had about 8 of them, but in fact, we'll scratch that because it's rubbish. That's not classless at all. It's quite a classy car. There are various cars whose owners can't easily be categorised just on site. Obviously, to say that you've said the Mini, the old Land Rover, that's the Miari, and the Twingo. That's
That's
four.
right.
But
Yeah,
listeners,
I mean, I'd also say, yeah, I mean, I actually had the Twingo written down as well because that always looks very good in whatever European capital you happen to be
yeah,
in, especially if it's been booted about a bit. But it is also the case with little Fiats as well. So a Fiat 500 is certainly falls into that, and Fiat Pandas as well.
yeah, the
Tremendously
Fiat
great.
Panda.
Mm,
Yes, we should do that in the show sometime. On the
yeah.
we should do sorry, we should do that in the podcast sometime. Lots of stories to be told about the Fiat Panda and the Seat Panda as well. Actually, there's a story
Mm.
about it, but we'll leave that for another day. What I'd say is this is addressed really to the listeners. If you can think of any other cars that to your mind are classless, let us know. We'd love to hear from you about it, and we'd be happy to discuss and debate those in a forthcoming podcast. So do let us know. Anyway, moving on from that, we'll sort of go back to slightly grimier times. That's the 1970s to look at motoring 1970s style. Now, it was a decade, James, obviously, of flared trousers, glam rock, a punk rock, disco, a decade really of grime and glitz. And in that time, motoring really underwent quite, I think, a substantial revolution. Lots have happened in it. I'll give you a couple of things and then
Yeah.
obviously fire back. One is obviously in that decade with the rise of Ford to a dominant position in the UK market. And the corresponding fall of BLMC, then British Leyland, and obviously Chrysler UK, Chrysler Europe went, and Citroen as well was absorbed, both being absorbed into the Peugeot empire. So that's in itself, that's quite a big change. So that's one thing. But what can you think of from that period?
Well, for me, David, the 1970s is basically last week. Really, it seems so very close to me. Whereas if you ask me to ponder the 2000s, I sort of struggle a bit really. But yeah, the 1970s is crystal clear to me. And it was a very interesting time because there just seemed to be well, there are classes of cars from that era which we don't have anymore. I mean, it is two
Hmm.
door saloons
Yeah.
and I know they went on for a bit, but that was still a thing, wasn't it? And also two door estates was another sort of subgenre, wasn't it? That seems to have gone away, and yet there were some very classy little cars. Which would fall into that category, and there was some Fiats, and I think there was even an Alpha, wasn't there? An Alpha Sud, which you could get. I can't remember whether it came here as a two door estate.
Don't know is a short answer.
No.
And I should know. So that's this going back to my head with the lump of wood. Hang on. Oh yeah, that's it. Sorted out now. Yes, I still don't remember, unfortunately.
No.
But yeah, you're right. There were lots of interesting cars and lots of types of cars that we just don't see anymore. Any estate car nowadays is rare, let alone two
It
door.
is. Yeah.
And of course, two door became known to in Porsche circles as the shooting brake, James.
Mm.
Rare
Yeah.
shooting brake. But yeah, in the 70s, it was a decade, obviously, of rust. We know all that.
Yeah.
But I also saw the rise of Volkswagen because when they started the decade, they weren't really producing even water cooled cars. It was the K70 came along, was the first one,
Mm.
which they acquired from NSU. And within a few years, they produced the Polo, the Scirocco, the Passat, and the Golf, and really revolutionised their status and their position in the market within really half a decade. It was quite remarkable to behold. I don't really remember that, but looking back, you think it is quite a remarkable transformation in a company's fortunes. They hit on a certain recipe. It was a good recipe, and they took full advantage of it. It was also the decade that the GTI came into being, or the hot hatch, shall we say. And the first hot hatch really wasn't the Golf GTI, James, was it?
No, no, I don't think it was,
It
David.
wasn't.
You know.
No, it was a Simca 1100 Ti. It was more of a warm hatch than a hot hatch, but it was there first. It wasn't a patch in the Golf GTI, let's be honest, and it opened the door very slightly to a market, and then the Golf GTI kicked that door in. And but Simca was there first. Also, the 70s, the decade of it was energy crisis with lots of strikes, rising fuel prices. It all really stemmed from fallout from the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and that a lot of manufacturers really struggled because petrol prices went up so much in the wake of that that gas guzzling cars weren't sold. and they just couldn't sell them. And people were buying smaller cars. Sports cars really fell out of favour for a time. And even though you had great cars then with V8 and V12 engines, that probably marked the beginning of the end for them. It was a long, slow death, but nonetheless, I think that's when it started. And we also had, in the 70s, the advent of the turbocharger, in European terms anyway, with the 2002 turbo, and then later the Saab 99 turbo. And towards the end of the decade, Renault started to get in the act as well. All great cars. And the final thing I'd say about it, if you're looking at that decade, is the rise of the Japanese motor industry in European terms. At that time, they were subject to import tariffs. They couldn't build or bring in too many cars to Europe. It's not that they made great cars, James, either, but they made
No,
cars that were reliable, they were competitively priced, and the Americans would say, and certainly by 70 standards, they were fully loaded. And it took European manufacturers a while to catch up with that. And in some cases, they never did.
no, I don't think an awful lot of them did. But I can highly recommend the British car industry, our part in its downfall. If you like a detailed explanation of what went on in the 70s.
Hmm.
Uh, who wrote that? I have no idea, David. But you never know.
Oh, just some plonker, probably.
Yeah,
Wasn't you, was it,
absolutely.
James?
No, no way.
No. 70s was also a time when ZZ Top, or ZZ Top as you're fond of calling them, started to have enjoy some success. And unfortunately, this week we've seen the passing of the bass guitarist Dusty Hill. A bit of a, not so much a car man, but Billy Gibbons was a great fan of Hot Rods, his bandmate. The world's a poor place for Dusty Hill passing. I think at Bangers and Classics we'd just like to record that.
Absolutely.
And on that note, we'll take a break now and move on to something else.
Yeah.
This is Bangers and Classics, home of more banter than you can shake a gear stick at. Plus, there are fun contests, and coming soon, some really very chaotic, or is that chaotic, quests. So yeah, James, obviously the 1970s
Yeah.
we've covered that. The previous decade, though, saw man go into space for the first time. Or human beings, shall we say, go into space for the first time. And certainly the American astronauts, the early ones at least, were big car fans. And in particular, many of them were fans of the Chevrolet Corvette. And I believe that's something you know a little bit about.
Well, I think you know more than me, David. But I was aware of this story. In that, what it basically amounts to is a fantastic dealership initiative to it's a very cheap way of promoting your car by giving an astronaut one of yours to drive around in.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Anyway, yeah, James. So yeah, it was a dealer initiative. There's a book by Tom Wolfe called The
Yeah.
Right Stuff, which later made into a film.
Yes.
Both are great. Listeners, seek out this book. It's called The Right Stuff. It's about the original Mercury astronauts. It's a terrific read. Buy it. That's all I'm saying. Buy the book because it really is great stuff. But going back to the astronauts, James, one of them actually had a Corvette long before the dealer initiative. And that was Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space.
Yeah.
He owned a succession of Corvettes, and I think he had a 57 Corvette at the time he joined the Mercury program. But the dealer you mentioned was a chap called Jim Rathman,
Yeah.
who won a round of the Formula One World Championship without actually driving in a Formula One race. And the reason for that is he won the Indianapolis 500, which at that time was a round of the World Championship, even though it wasn't run to F1 rules. He won it in 1960, and he shortly thereafter started up his own dealership in Florida.
It may be hard for people to understand just sort of what superstars these men were because they were test pilots. Some of them I had certainly fought in the Korean War. I don't know whether any of them were World War II. I don't think they were, but they were just incredibly brave chaps who sort of stared death in the face, really, for the benefit of humankind. Really, they actually took on feats which is actually quite hard to comprehend these days. I mean, when you look at some of the people going into space now, people who own retail outlets, it's really it really isn't the same, is it?
No.
They really were pushing the envelope. So when they were down on Earth, what they needed was an exciting car, and actually a Corvette that goes right back to the original one, was actually a very exciting car to drive. It was
Yeah.
very powerful, but obviously being an American car, it was very good value.
Mm.
As well, because they weren't paid a fortune. I mean, they basically worked for the Air Force, but really, spaceman as they were just were the term hero is way overused now, but they really were, because when they went up in these rockets, there wasn't a guarantee that they were ever going to come down, and
Yeah.
certainly be on top of and in fact many didn't. And if you think about it, yeah, they were on top of an intergalactic missile, weren't they?
Yeah, we're top of an
But
ICBM, basically. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. But originally, there were 7 astronauts originally for the Mercury program. One of them wasn't allowed to fly, as it turned out. He had a slight defect with his heart. He did, however, later on, many years later, get to go up on the space shuttle mission. So, he got to do it eventually because
Mm,
he stayed on with NASA. But as you say, a lot of these guys were test pilots. They weren't actually the cream of the test pilot fleet, as it were. Some of the most famous guys weren't considered. One or two of them weren't actually military personnel. I think Scott Crossfield was one of the foremost early test pilots. He couldn't go. He wasn't an employee of the Air Force or the Navy or whatever. And Chuck Yeager,
yeah.
who was the
Mm,
man who broke the sound barrier,
yeah.
you know, absolutely the cream of test pilots. He couldn't go. He wasn't eligible because he hadn't been to college. But he'd went to World War II instead, and he didn't go to college. He stayed in the Air Force, and he became a legend. And in his case, rightly so. I mean, he broke the sound barrier with cracked ribs, for goodness sake, which was a remarkably brave thing to do. But as you say, they sat on top of these rockets, and they had a lot of failures. The American space program with the rockets, a lot of them blown up, and so it wasn't just a question of sitting there having a nice, easy, comfortable ride into space and back. It was really fraught with danger, and so it took a certain type of guy to do that. And most of them loved cars. Most of them loved rat racing away from the day jobs as pilots and then obviously astronauts. And this deal that was brokered basically saw many of them get into new Corvettes. One of the exceptions was John Glenn, who became quite a famous chap. He went into politics after the astronaut program, after his role in it finished. He chose a station wagon instead, being a family man. He wasn't interested in sports cars. But the rest of them pretty much were, and
Yeah.
they made full use of them. But later on, the program continued, and Apollo 12, the 3 astronauts in it, all got identical 1969 Corvettes from this dealer. There's a famous photo of them, of the 3 identical cars with the astronauts sitting on them. And, why not? You're risking your lives. You might as well get a nice freebie out of it because they weren't paid massive sums of money. Certainly the lifestyles they enjoyed were nothing like a Premiership footballer's lifestyle nowadays. And so I think they earned the right to get a free car or two out of it. If you watch the film Apollo 13 as well, you'll see the Tom Hanks character Jim Lovell, and there's a scene in which he's driving his Corvette. He had one as well. The deal ended in 1971, and that's because I think interest in the Apollo program was being lost at that time. People were getting blasé. Oh yeah, we've been to the moon, we've put men in the moon. So what? And of course, Vietnam was raging, so there's other things to occupy them. But for a period, these guys were not only going out into space, but on the ground they were driving muscle cars that they got for free and driving them with some considerable abandon. And it's a time, again, it's never going to be repeated, James, is it? This is
No.
this is it. It's a moment
Mm,
in history, and it's appropriate, of course, that these guys who are Americans drove an American car. In Russia, the first man in space was Yuri Gagarin,
mm.
and he, of course, was absolutely no less brave than the Americans. And he unfortunately lost his life in an air crash some years later. But he was given a sports car, not by Russia, but by France. They gave him a Matra Jet, which he was pictured in Moscow. He didn't drive the car around much because, being a very humble sort of chap, he felt it was a bit ostentatious to be driving around in the Soviet bloc in a nice European sports car. But the car still exists somewhere. I'm not sure where. It's believed to be in a private collection, but that's one car that, if you're really into the space program, that'd be the one to have, I think, James, if you're a
Yeah.
collector.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
know, the car that was driven by Gagarin. Anyway, so we've done space, we've done inner space, we've done outer space. What can we do next? What have I done with my notes? Nah, I'm just making this up as I go along. We have one more thing we're going to touch on quickly, I
Yeah.
think. And that was car manufacturers who did other things apart from make cars. Now, there's a long list of them, but I thought we could maybe concentrate on some of the lesser known ones. And Colin Chapman and Lotus, obviously, Colin Chapman and Lotus are both very well known. But how many people know that Colin Chapman also owned, he also owned a boat making company called JCL Marine, who made Moonraker boats. He acquired it in 1971, and a lot of Lotus personnel worked there. And Chapman introduced some of the ideas he had from the car business, including the Vari process used in fiberglass bodies, to boat hulls.
Yeah.
Didn't last long. The company went into voluntary liquidation whilst Chapman was still alive. So we've done Lotus, James. Anyone else you can think of?
No, because I do agree with you that the smaller stories are far more interesting than the larger ones, because it's quite easy to go down the route of Hyundai, who basically build everything on the planet in Korea.
Daewoo as well before them, yeah.
Daewoo as well, absolutely. And it's Peugeot actually built some strange stuff as well, didn't they? Kitchen utensils and stuff for some time. And I think then you can go into Wolsey, didn't they do farming equipment and stuff like that? So yeah, but
Lamborghini.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you can still buy a Lamborghini tractor to this day.
You certainly can. But yeah, as we were talking about jet aircraft, obviously the most famous one would be Saab. So Saab, for many years, made great play on the fact that they made cars and they made jet aircraft. Viggens.
They weren't the only car company to do that. Matra was involved in aerospace and defence before car manufacturing. And then one of the cars after one of the missiles, the M530. But they also went into publishing and telecommunications. Now, I remember going to France in the 90s once and finding a Matra phone in my hotel room. Since I was going to a Matra event, that was pretty cool, I thought. Unfortunately, the car company went. The Matra still exists and it's still involved in the world of publishing. You won't find its name there. It's known as Hachette in publishing.
Right.
But I believe the defence side of it, the aerospace side of it, did merge with other people over time. They really started out doing something else and moved into cars almost by accident. Then, of course, you had the big man himself, John Z. DeLorean.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple of great books about John DeLorean from back in the day. One is Hillel Levin's book, which I think is called The Grand Illusion. And the second one is by Fallon and Strodes, and I think it's called Dreamcatcher, Dream Chaser, I think it is. Actually, I've checked that because I've got a copy somewhere. Written back in the 80s, really before DeLorean's court case was all resolved, etc. They're both fascinating reads. If you can get hold of a copy, please do so. We're always saying in this podcast about reading books. These two books are two very good reasons why we say that, because they're excellent. However, one of the stories in both books is about John DeLorean, not just being satisfied with having a car company. He also bought a company that made snowcats. That was Logan Manufacturing. He bought that in 1978, a little while before the DMC-12 came along. And he later rebranded Logan Manufacturing as LMC. The car company was DMC. Well, if you read the books, his period of ownership was fairly controversial in some respects. I'll leave it at that because I don't want to spoil the books. But so his interest in Logan lasted rather longer than his interest in car manufacturing. But yeah, there's lots of other examples of that. If you can think of any, guys, please let us know and we'll be happy to discuss them on the podcast. Right, Mr. Ruppert, is there any other business for this week? Have you got any other examples of car companies or anything you want to say? Yeah, there's one more thing, James, for this week's podcast. We'll just rattle through this. We'll finish on a bit of a higher note than John DeLorean. And that is, if you remember, again, this goes back to the 70s. It's that decade again.
Yeah.
You remember Hustler, don't you, James? And I am not talking about the adult magazine.
I'm familiar with many things, but strangely enough, a friend of mine who actually specialised in minis in the early 90s actually did have one of those, and so I did have access. I must send you a picture of that I had experience of. But basically, it was basically a greenhouse mini, I would describe it as.
I like it. I mean, if you're wondering what we're talking about, it's a car called the Hustler. It was designed by William Towns, who, amongst his other claims to fame, he did various things. Worked for Aston Martin as a stylist for a while and was responsible for the Lagonda and the Bulldog. And went on to do, as I say, I think the Reliant Scimitar. Was it the SS1 or was it the SST he did? And the project called the Railton that never got off the ground. But there's various things Towns did. He died at a tragically young age, I think just in his 50s, but he certainly left behind an interesting body of work. And one of the things he left behind was the Hustler. It was a kit car, as you say, James Mini based, came out in 1978. It had very, very angular two-box styling, and it was kind of a sloping front, followed by a sort of cube or a rectangle on top of mini subframes. It sounds terrible, but it isn't terrible. It's great. The side windows also doubled as doors. You slid them, and you could. I don't know what version your friend had, but you could get it in a 4-wheel version and a 6-wheel version. Now, how many cars can you say that about?
Virtually nil.
Yeah, virtually nil. He also brought out a wooden version using marine ply, and that came along later. I think it was called the Hustler in Wood, and I'd be surprised if the blurb didn't say, "Finally, it's a car that grows on trees." So there was that. There was a one-box version as well. I suppose the quintessential MPV shape came along. It was called the Hustler Holiday, and that came along sometime in the 80s. But there also was one, forgetting minis, this one was a Highlander 6 with 6 wheels, had a 5.3 litre Jaguar V12 in it. That would have been quite something to drive, I reckon.
Goodness me.
Yeah. I could just see you driving that, James.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I could. I think that would fit with you perfectly. Yeah, definitely. I'd probably be out hitchhiking there, covered in water, looking bedraggled, and you'd drive past me in your 5.3 litre Hustler Holiday, so looking down, saying, "Oik."
But I mean, would we consider that, David, as a classless car?
Well, you see, there's the thing. The Hustler could be a classless car. I think it's that kind of vehicle. It's an enthusiast car. I think it's a vehicle for people who like style, maybe who like design, but as a city car or a town car, pretty practical. Maybe you wouldn't want to be in an accident one. That's the only thing. But used within certain parameters, I think it'd be a good car, and I think it would be classless. There were something like 500 of them made. Production seems to have ended sometime in the 80s, late 80s. There are still some around today, and there's actually a video on YouTube. I can't remember the name of the chap actually driving one, and it looked a hoot to drive as well. This looked great fun. So if anyone wants to know what to buy me for Christmas, you can buy me a Hustler, and I don't mean the magazine. The wife would kill me. Anyway, I think on that note, and that fairly upbeat note for a change, we'll call it a day for this week. So thank you again, Mr. Ruppert, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, and it's a goodbye from me. I'm still waiting for the exhaust pipe from Poland.
Huh? Yeah, it's an exhausting process, James.
It is, very much so.
That's it, yes. I know, it's shocking. Right, take care, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.